Once again, I want to welcome you all here. We're all here because we are all concerned about the future of this young generation of children and what's going on in our country right now. So I want to thank you for taking your time on a Saturday to be here. Those that are watching live stream, thank you for watching, and please share this with others. You know, if we don't have the knowledge of what's going on, if we don't have the awareness, we don't know what we can do to make a difference. So the first thing is we've got to be aware of the truth of what is really going on, and that's what this is all about. So with that said, we have Dr. Duke Pesta. This is his second trip down here. And we're so grateful that he has taken his time to come and speak to us, to give us the truth and reality and lay that foundation of what is really going on in the American public education and how this has gotten started and why we're where we are. But Dr. Duke is a professor at the University of Wisconsin. He's given over 700 Common Core related talks throughout the nation in 48 states. And he's testified before 24 state legislators. So he is, in my eyes, he's probably the top national speaker on this subject matter. But before we get started and have Dr. Duke talk with you, I would like to ask my pastor, Dr. Brian Robertson, pastor here at Greenville Springs Baptist Church, which is where I go to church, to come up and to open us in a word of prayer.
Let's pray together. Father, we thank you again for the opportunity to come and worship. Lord, also to learn. Father, one of the things that we hear in the New Testament is the word believe. Father, believing is not intellectual beliefs alone, and what we can memorize and things that we simply know. But Father, when John spoke about believing in his gospel, he would always speak about a belief based upon experience, what we know personally. And Father, I believe with all my heart that there are some who say they believe in Jesus, but they do not know Jesus personally. God, it's so critical that as people, we have a personal walk with the Lord, that we teach and train our children to love Him more than anyone or anything else. And the Father, when they hear things that run contrary to His word, that Father, we know that we are to stand on what you say and not on the fleeting whims of the day. God, I pray again for Dr. Pesta as he comes, as he speaks. Father, truly, these are very scary things that are happening in our nation. And yet, God, I still hold to your truth that says you're greater than all the things of this world. And so, Father, I pray you would open the eyes of people who are blinded. Father, may you remove the scales of those who cannot see. And I pray, Lord, that you would reveal your truth to us. And may we live by that truth alone in Jesus Christ. For he is alone our only Lord and our only Savior. In his name we pray. Amen.
Well, thank y'all for being here this morning. I really appreciate it. Can I ask how many of you have not heard any aspect of this presentation before? How many of you? So good. There's a fair number of you. That is good. So I apologize for being a little late today. We had a couple technical issues, and we wanted some people to arrive. We have it's an early morning, so people are still pouring in from the outside. But I will make adjustments in the talk so that we'll be on schedule before lunch. So we'll catch that up. So don't worry about that. We won't hold you any longer than we have to. And again, thanks for being here. Well, the biggest thing I want to talk to you about in the first part of my talk, two things I'm going to do. I'm going to talk first about what is the situation here, what is Common Core, what is happening. I think by the time you are done, you will have an absolute understanding of how we got to this point. The biggest problem we face as parents, the biggest problem we face as a country is that education reform has happened so fast, and it has never been voted on. It's never been brought to the American people to consider. These things are taking place without your knowledge. These things are taking place without your consent, both at the state level and the federal level. And so the overwhelming watchword for the state of American education today is confusion. People don't know what happens, they don't know how it's happened, and they don't know why. If you don't know that, there's no way you can fight back. Because when you go into a public school, you talk to a superintendent, and they tell you, for instance, this will happen in every state, every school in Louisiana. You walk into any public school, the principal, the superintendent will tell you, we don't do Common Core in Louisiana. and you're all keyed up, right? I know Common Core is bad. I've studied. I've heard people speak, and then let me stop you right there, man. We don't do it. And you're sitting in his office. What recourse do you have, right? He's the superintendent. He's the principal. He told you we're not doing it. He's not going to argue with you, but it's not true. And so what's going to happen in the first part of my talk, and we'll have a break between the two talks in the morning, is I'm going to show you what's happening, how it happened, and every piece of information I'm going to show you, you can have it. So I've got business cards up here. When the talk is done or at the break, grab one. Just email me. The email's on the card, and I'll send you the information. This way you have it. You can send it on to other people. You could show it to your superintendents. You'll know now, verifiably, what's happening, and so you'll be better primed when you're talking to people, and especially lawmakers. That's critical. It's absolutely critically important that you elect, in these coming elections in the fall, you elect politicians who know what this is and who know how to fight it. We had about 89 people here last night, 7 or 8 legislators, people running for office who know now. Mr. Rogers Pope was here. He gets this. They've been fighting this forever. The purpose of this talk is to end the confusion so you now know very conversantly, have the information that I will send you, and then get people in office who will fight it, okay? So let's start with confusion. And I ask that you bear with me a little bit, because the big mistake people make is they think that Common Core is the problem. That 5-7 years ago, somebody invented Common Core. The schools were perfectly fine before then. Nothing was wrong. And then 5 years ago, this came into our schools, and boom, we have a problem. So if we just get rid of Common Core, like your superintendent said is gone, right? If we just get rid of it, everything's back to normal. It's not true. You have to understand how we got here. And a seminal moment in the history of American education was 1979, when we created a federal Department of Education. That was a big mistake, unconstitutional too. The Founding Fathers made no provision for public schools for a reason. The Founding Fathers ran away from a system where the state controlled education. And when the state controls education, inevitably, it may take 10 years, it may take 100 years. Inevitably, the state will start educating your children for their benefit, not for your local communities, not for your local religious traditions. And that's kind of where we are now. When we created the Federal Department of Education in 1979, immediately, the only purpose of the Federal Department of Education is to control things. It's a typical federal agency. Prior to 1979, Congress simply gave the states money based on how many school kids you had. Utterly apolitical. You got 400,000 school kids in Louisiana. Here's that money based on each student per kid. But when the feds created the Department of Education, that money now didn't go right to the states. It went first to the Department of Education. And what they did is they started making conditions. Well, you can have your money, Louisiana, for your 400,000 students, but you have to adopt these tests. You have to adopt these curriculum standards. You have to teach this kind of sociology in your classrooms. And that's been going on for 50 years now, 40 years. And they're twisting the screws more and more. In fact, we've reached the point now where the federal government is basically dictating education policies to the state. And, it's okay. They're giving you money to give up your educational freedom, right? And that's another important point to raise. There's not a state in this union, not one of the 50, that gets more than 8% or so of its education budget from the feds. So we have given away, as states, we have given away the right to control our own kids' education for about 8% of our yearly budget, which is nothing. If we just refused that money and found another way to raise that 8%, you could tell the federal government, we're not going to play ball with you anymore. But not a state in the union's done it. Let's be clear. 8% of your huge education budget is still a lot of money. But it's a pittance compared to what you have given away. So to understand and to eliminate this confusion, we've got to go back. We did not have an American public school system in America until 1850, a good 80 years after the founding of the country. And the person who created the Federal Department of Education was not an educator himself until later in his life. He did not have the imprimatur of the government. He wasn't a government employee. He hadn't been elected to public office. He just decided we needed one. His name was Horace Mann. And you'll find monuments and statues and schools named after Horace Mann in every state in the Union. But when Horace Mann created the American public school system, he was explicit in why he created it. He did not create it to educate your kids better. He did not create it to make sure your kids were smarter or prepared for college or mastered subject matter in English or math or science. He created the public school system to control your kids and to separate them from the parents. That was his mission. Matter of fact, he had to figure out what model he was going to base the American public school system on. And so he chose, of all the possibilities, the authoritarian Prussian system of education. Prussia was a region of Germany in the 19th century. You may remember Otto von Bismarck, and very militaristic. The Prussians used to take their children away from the parents by the time they were 3 years old, publicly boarded them, and trained them to be monolithically one-sided warriors of the state, right? In fact, the kind of education that the Prussians gave their children, divorcing them from parents, is exactly the kind of education a generation later Hitler would institute in Germany with the Hitler Jugend, right? Where you take the kids from the parents, you brainwash them, you make them good little wards of the state. I mentioned last night, by the time in Hitler's Germany, after the Hitler Jugend got going in the middle of the 1930s, 7-year-old children were actually betraying their parents to the state and having them arrested. That's the model that consciously Horace Mann chose. Here's one of his comments. By 1850, when he created it, Horace Mann wrote, "After a child has arrived at the legal age for attending school, whether child of noble or peasant, the only two absolute grounds of exemption from attendance are sickness and death. We who are engaged in the sacred cause of education are entitled to look upon all parents as having given hostages to our cause." 1850. Your kids are hostages to our program of public education. You forfeit your rights, Horace Mann said, when your kids come to our public schools. And if you understand what's going on in the last 10 years, that's exactly where we are now. Public schools are teaching your kids all sorts of things you didn't ask them to. Sexuality, ideology, transgenderism. In young grades, middle school and elementary school grades now. 10 years ago, remember 15 years ago, the public schools were begging parents to get involved in their kids' education. Help us, right? Help us. Be partners with us to educate your kids. 15 years later, they're telling you, we don't want you in the public schools. Don't help your kids with their homework. Don't pay any attention to what was not your job to educate your kids. That's how quickly this has turned. Understand, though, 1850, from the moment this school system was conceived, that was the ultimate goal. I'm not saying, by the way, I'm not saying American public schools from 1850 to 1950 did nothing but indoctrinate kids. I'm not suggesting that. I'm saying that over time, with all of the educrats in charge, there has been one mission. The second most important figure in the history of American education is John Dewey. In fact, in some ways, John Dewey had a much bigger influence on public schools than Horace Mann did. And John Dewey, he was a philosopher, he was a humanist. He wrote the Humanist Manifesto. Remember that? The Humanist Manifesto states, its opening premise, it's a manifesto that was written in the 20s and 30s by atheist progressive communists. And they say in the Humanist Manifesto what their objective is. The first bullet point of the Humanist Manifesto is there is no God, there never has been a God. There is no authority other than physics and biology. Dewey wasn't a pretend communist. John Dewey was an actual member of the Communist Party. He actually flew to Russia to talk to Vladimir Lenin about the correct way to educate children. And as you know, it wasn't just the Nazis, it was the Bolsheviks too. They took kids away from their parents. They educated them in public boarding schools. They turned them into mindless robots for the state, the Bolsheviks did. And look, we know the Nazis were socialists too, right? The word Nazi stands for National Sozialistische Deutsche Arbeiterpartei, right? The National Socialist Party. In your schools, my university system in Wisconsin, it's considered a very good university system. My college juniors and seniors think that the Nazis were Christian conservatives. I, an English professor, have to tell my senior English majors at the University of Wisconsin that you've got it exactly wrong. Hitler despised Christianity. They were occultists. They were white supremacist eugenicists. They were not Christians. They suppressed Christianity. And not only did they suppress Christianity, but they were dyed-in-the-wool socialists. I have to tell these kids because no one else has told them. And so so John Dewey flew to Russia to talk to Lenin. And remember what Lenin said about education. He said, "You Westerners," he said, "you can have your parliaments, you can have your houses of Congress, you can have your White Houses. Give us your elementary students." Remember, and fast forward from Vladimir Lenin in 1917 to Bill Ayers in 2007, right? 90 years later. Bill Ayers, of course, was the major proponent of Barack Obama's campaign. His campaign began in Bill Ayers' living room. And remember what happened with Bill Ayers. Bill Ayers was an unrepentant terrorist bomber of the Pentagon. Remember that? The Weather Underground in the 1960s. Didn't go to jail for his crimes. And the only really career that was open to Bill Ayers after his bombing career was a professor of elementary education. He was a professor of elementary education for 30 years at the University of Illinois, Chicago. And do you know what his entire premise was? He taught tens of thousands of young teachers. His premise was, and I quote, the direct quote from him, "The place for communism in America is the elementary school." That's what happened, right? Here's what John Dewey says. That was Bill Ayers, right, who launched Obama's campaign and who was a Weather Underground terrorist in the 1960s. Here's what John Dewey says about your kids' education in the early 1920s. "Children who know how to think for themselves spoil the harmony of the collective society which is coming, where everyone will be interdependent." So Horace Mann told you that the purpose, your kids are hostages to our worldview. It's not about education. John Dewey said specifically that we do not want your kids to think critically. Think about what's happening on college campuses now, right? You've got these kids on campus who don't know anything. You've all seen the interviews, right? Where somebody sticks a microphone on somebody on a college campus and says, "Who's your state senator? How many Supreme Court justices are there?" Right? And these kids at places like Harvard and Yale are paying $60,000 a year to go, and they can tell you nothing. But what they are is militantly political, right? Critical thinking. We don't want them to think critically. We don't want them to be exposed to the great books of Western culture. The more you educate a child, the more independent a child's education is, the less they're going to rely on government. One of the most I mentioned confusion. The purpose of this talk is to dispel confusion. Everybody says to me who doesn't know this story, "Well, that doesn't make any sense, Dr. Pesta. It sounds like tinfoil hat stuff. You're actually telling me that the government wants dumber kids? Our elected officials, our teachers' unions, want undereducated kids? That doesn't make any sense to me." But see already from the earliest levels what they're saying. And what would be the purpose? Children who cannot create their own wealth when they're adults. Children who cannot look after their families. Children who can't become entrepreneurs or free market capitalists. To whom do they turn for all their needs? How quickly are they willing to sacrifice their freedoms for security? Why do 54%, in a recent Gallup poll, 54% of millennials say they prefer socialism to capitalism? 54% of the mid-30s and younger. And when I ask those kids what socialism is, they don't know. They've never heard about it. They've never heard about 150 million dead bodies in the wake of socialism. Nobody's told them that. Again, they think the Nazis were Christian right-wingers. And the apologetics tour for the Soviet Union is unbelievable. You see it on your campuses today. Universities are the places, more than any place else, where socialism reigns. And I have a theory about that. We professors, we start school at 5 years old. As soon as we get done with high school, we go into college. 4 years later, we get our degree. Then we get our master's degree 2 years later. And then 6 years later, you get your PhD. Most of the professoriate has been in school from the time they were 5 years old and they never left it. And so it makes perfect sense that college professors are socialists. Universities are the perfect socialist milieu, right? Think about it. I teach 3 or 4 times a week. Get up there a couple times a week and teach. Somebody else vacuums the carpet. Somebody else erases the blackboard. Somebody else pipes the food into the cafeteria. Somebody else mows the lawns and unclogs the plumbing. Somebody else polices campus. We don't do anything. Everybody else does it. We're the only ones who get tenure. We get up a couple times a week and talk, and after 6 years, we can never be fired no matter what we do. Even to the point of abusing students, they won't fire us. But everybody else whose names we don't know, who get paid much less than we do, they make sure everything runs smoothly. That, my friends, is socialism. It's exactly why it works on college campuses. Most professors have never had to meet a payroll. Most professors have never, ever had to be responsible for somebody else's health care. Most professors have never, ever, ever had to engage in the kind of competition that is required in markets. After 6 years, they're tenured for life. But they're passing that on to the kids now, right? Children who know how to think for themselves spoil the coming collectivist harmony. And are you beginning to see already? You want one word to explain all of this. And I'm going to move forward. What? Better, even a bigger word than that. Globalism, which is ultimately communism. You think about what is being called for here. What they want is one world government, and to get it, they have to have one world education. That's what this is about. The more your kids are beholden to you for your education, the more you seek to pass your religious values, your patriotic values onto your children, the less they fall in line with this. It's even bigger than communism. It's globalism, right? You may know that Agenda 2130, the UN initiative, has an entire section devoted to educating your children. And when you read it, it has nothing to do with math or science or arithmetic. It has everything to do with changing your children's attitudes to what government is. And you want a parallel cause? Look at what's happening now with borders. You have 20 Democrat presidential candidates, and every one of them wants us to completely throw our borders open. No enforcement whatsoever. Anybody, for any reason, who comes here immediately should become a citizen and be granted full benefits and welfare packages. That's a mainstream position in the Democrat Party now. And half the Republicans are sympathetic to that. How did that happen in the space of 10 years? You understand that you can't have globalism until you get rid of borders. And you can't have globalism until children know no other way. We do not want children who think for themselves. And you know who paid for John Dewey to fly to, who his major benefactor was, who paid Dewey a lot of money to do this kind of research on kids? It was John D. Rockefeller, right? And Rockefeller in the 1930s was a huge supporter of both Bolshevik communism and the Nazi Party. Here's what John Rockefeller, another person, you see a trend here. John Dewey was never formally educated as a teacher. Horace Mann was not formally educated as a teacher. John Rockefeller has no educational background. Here's what Rockefeller said in the 1930s. In our dreams, this is what we hope will happen. In our dreams, people will yield themselves with perfect docility to our molding hands. The present educational conventions, which used to be intellectual education and character development. Let me just pause for a second. That is the definition of Christian education. The definition of Christian education is educating kids to have better moral values first, and secondarily, educating them to work and make a career in life. That is, from the very beginning of socialism in the mid-19th century, the key enemy of socialism has always been Christianity, always. Though it's why your American public schools that scream separation of church and state whenever the name of Jesus is mentioned have no problem teaching the 5 pillars of Islam to your kids. It's not that they dislike religion, but they recognize that there are aspects of global Islam that are already fascist, right? You think about global Islam. It is more or less fascist. The vast majority of Muslims in most countries can't read, or can't read at a high enough level even to read the Quran. It's mediated for them by priests who know, but they don't know. And you think about the authoritarian, oftentimes theocratic governments that come with Islam. That's why the progressive left not only has no problem with Islam, they welcome it. The ultimate aims are the same. Islam wants a global caliphate. The progressives want one world global government. These are temporary allies. And here's my thought. The progressive left thinks that when everything else has been eradicated, except radical Islam and radical globalism, they think they're going to win that last battle. They're wrong. If it ever came to that, those who believe in something will always trump those who believe in nothing. But they're not worried about that. Right now, if they can associate themselves with that kind of radicalness, the same kind of global ambitions, even if it's hostile to their worldview, those are allies that are well made for them. Here's what Rockefeller said. In our dreams, people will yield themselves with perfect docility to our molding hands. The present educational conventions, intellectual and character education, will fade from their minds, and unhampered by tradition, we will work our own goodwill upon a grateful and responsive folk. We shall not try to make these people or any of their children into philosophers or men of learning or men of science. No. The task we set for ourselves is very simple. We will organize children and teach them to do in a perfect way things that their fathers and mothers are doing in an imperfect way. We will not teach these people or their children to become philosophers or scholars or men of science. No. We're going to organize children. We're going to marshal them in the name of social justice. They didn't call it that back then. The new name for socialism in America today is social justice. Just like in the 1960s, it was liberation theology, right? They know that people will react negatively to socialism, so they rename it. Think about Common Core now. What do you think the word common in Common Core means? It means every child must have the same education, or else it's unjust. And you know as well as I do, if you set a high standard for education, what does that mean? Many kids fall short. If you set a low standard for education, what happens? The lower you set the standard, the more kids can meet it. That's called social justice. Again, raise your hand if you think your kids are common. Not. 800 talks, not one hand has ever gone up. Raise your hand if your kids are standard. No, of course they're not. You know, and as parents, you teach your kids. You may not have PhDs and you may have never had an education course, but what is parenting but teaching? From the moment the children are conceived, you're playing music and talking to them. Everything we do as parents is teaching. And you know, you can't even teach your son and your daughter the same way. You got 3 boys, and they all have different specialties. They're all better different things. You can't, in your own family, you can't adopt a one-size-fits-all education for your children. But the federal government is now telling you, we're going to take 60 million American schools and subject them to the exact same form of education. And you know what the common means, right? Lowest common denominator. It's unjust that your kid's better at math than my kid. It's unjust that your kid is innately able to read higher than my kid. And rather than raising the lowest kids, which is what capitalism has done for a long time, think about it. What does capitalism do if it's practiced correctly? We don't have babies starving to death in this country, little babies with flies crawling on their faces like you see in Africa and India, right? We don't have that because our system, with whatever flaws there may be, is still elevated people, even the poorest in our country, are rich by global standards. And so rather than allowing us to continue to gradually raise the lowest performers, the socialist comes along and says, no, everyone will be poor in the name of equality. Everyone, right? What do they want for your economy as a socialist? All these Democrat candidates, they want third world economies, right? India and China are not white cultures, so we can't ask them to stop polluting, even though China's the biggest polluter in the world right now. We signed the Paris Accords, where only Western nations, most Western nations, by the way, America included, do a pretty good job cleaning up their messes. They have to radically lower the standard of living. Formerly third world countries aren't asked to. That shows you this is not about fixing the environment. By all means, let's turn the American economy into a second world economy. Let's do it. But China's going to continue to pollute the way it does, and you're not fixing the atmosphere one bit. It never was. The same way, education never was, from the public perspective, it was never meant to make your kids brilliant. In the same way that global warming is not meant to fix the planet. It's meant to punish first world nations. And you see it here too. And that word should give you chills. The word folk in the 1930s. Here you have an American, a wealthy American capitalist in the 1930s, who's using the word folk, which is the word Volka, which is the word the Germans and the Nazis used, right? Everything Hitler talked about was the Volka. That word is a tell in the 1930s. And isn't it interesting? What's changed between the 30s and today? How many globalist billionaires do you have? How many Bill Gateses? How many the tech giants? How many Bezoses? These left-wing billionaires who got rich on capitalist principles and now want to make sure nobody else gets rich. The same thing happening then, right? And what about the NEA? What about the national teachers unions? You would think the teachers unions care about kids. Well, no. If you listen to the teachers unions, all they care about is better pay and better circumstances for their teachers, which I'm not a big union guy, but if that's all they cared about, at least you could make an argument for their utility. But they have completely sold our kids out in pursuit of these. Did you watch over the last year? How many teachers read for ed movement, right? How many teachers walked out of classrooms for more pay? Many of these teachers know that the curriculum is ineffective, that kids aren't getting a good education. Where are our teachers walking out for better educational for our kids? And that's the teachers' union's influence. But the NAA, go back to 1947. 1947, right after World War II, where we thought we pushed back against fascist forces, right? As early as 1947, the NEA said this: far too many people, far too many Americans, both in and out of education, look upon the elementary school as the place to learn reading, writing, and arithmetic. 1947. Far too many Americans actually believe the purpose of school is reading, writing, and arithmetic. I'll bet you 95% of Louisiana moms right now, if you asked her, what do you send your kids to school for? To learn to read and write, right? 1948, what is the purpose of education, the NEA said? Education for international understanding involves the use of education as a force for conditioning the will of the people. The purpose of education is globalism, international understanding. That's what it's for. International understanding. And to do so, we must use education to get Americans to think differently about every issue, to condition the will of the people. And then by 1969, and we know what happened between 1947 and 1969 in America, the universities became radical hotbeds of socialism, right? By 1969, the universities had been given up to Marxism. And by 1969, here's what the NEA said: schools will become clinics whose purpose is to provide individualized psychosocial treatment for the student. And teachers must become psychosocial therapists. Have you heard the phrase social and emotional learning? That is in Louisiana schools right now. The primary underlying way Americans are teaching their kids in public schools now is called social and emotional learning. It's not about mastery of subject. It's not about academic excellence. It's about socializing and manipulating your children emotionally. Ask yourself this question: why are we teaching elementary school kids about transgenderism? Why are we taking kids as young as 5 and 6 now, kids too young to understand? You realize that little children, elementary school kids, their brains, the front of their brains have not developed biologically to be abstract thinkers. Gender, by definition, is an abstract concept. You're telling a 7-year-old that male and female is an arbitrary choice. They don't get it. You know what little kids are like. They're literalists. They believe in Santa Claus. If you tell them that the sky is blue because the Papa Smurf is up there coloring it, they're going to believe you. Yeah. There's a reason that throughout the long history of world culture, we've never taught 7-year-olds about heterosexuality. We've never sat 7-year-olds or 6-year-olds down and explained the mechanics of heterosexual sex to them because they can't process it. Now in all our schools, it's happening. And I must also remind you, you know who else used to do that? The Nazis and the Bolsheviks. When they took children away from their parents, what did they have to do? They had to divorce those kids from their Christian heritage. And the best way to do that is to sexualize them. When you sexualize little children, you're breaking down innocence, you're breaking down modesty, you're breaking down restraint, you're breaking down the boundaries that Christianity, Judeo-Christian values for 2,000 years have instilled in children. Once you break them down, then you can rebuild them in the way you want them to go now. And that should be a little bit scary because there are huge aspects of Common Core that do exactly what they said in 1969. Schools have become clinics where we socially engineer your kids. You've got teachers with 4-year degrees from elementary educational programs, and with all due respect to the teachers, you're not qualified to psychologically evaluate children. You do not have the tools to simply observe a kid in your class one day and decide that he's A or B or C. Our teachers are spending a lot of time, more time, as much time as they're teaching, trying to evaluate, to scan our kids for signs of bullying or signs of dysfunction or having uninclusive opinions. It's not their business and they're not trained to do it, but they told you it was coming. And how about jump ahead to 1983? Dewey's disciple, the chief architect under Dewey, John Dunphy, also a signer of the Humanist Manifesto, he said this in 1983 about where schools were going. And now in 1983, you were 4 years into the Department of Education era, right? Where now the federal aspects of the federal government control things. You know, at the Department of Education in Washington, you got about 5,000 employees, right? About 5,000. Do you know how many of them actually have degrees in education? Less than 10%. The vast majority of the Department of Education has no educational background. Let that sink in for a second. In 1983, Dunphy said this: "I am convinced that the battle for humankind's future must be waged and won in the public school classroom by," remember Lenin said that too? "By teachers who correctly perceive their role as proselytizers of a new faith. The classroom must and will become an arena of conflict between the old and the new, the rotting corpse of Christianity, together with all of its adjacent evils and misery, and the new faith of humanism, resplendent with the promise of a world in which the never-realized Christian ideal of love thy neighbor will finally be achieved." We're going to purge Christianity from the schools. We're going to purge its influence. We're going to use secular, materialist, atheist, progressive humanism as a way of fixing what, and this was the communist thing, right? How did the communists, who got rid of God, all of them, how did the communists and the socialists, without God, enforce morality? Answer: at the barrel of a gun. That's how they did it. You either are on board, comrade, or you're not around, comrade. Yeah. John Dunphy, he was the lieutenant to John Dewey, who was in the same way that Dewey was a generation younger than Horace Mann. Dunphy was a generation younger than Dewey. He learned at Dewey's feet. He worked with Dewey. He helped Dewey write the Humanist Manifesto. And at the end of his life in the 1980s, he argued this is where we have to go next, right? And if you move a little bit forward, 1980s, yeah. No, he's part of the, so we went from Horace Mann to John Dewey, right? And then we went from John Dewey to the NEA as to give you a sense of that, bracing that period. And then we went from the NEA back to Dewey's disciple, right? I didn't necessarily say he did specifically. Dewey was not a member of the NEA. I just threw the NEA in there to give you yet another example of major educational organizations who are all moving in the same way. Dewey? Absolutely. Sure. What I'm trying to suggest to you is this, that from the moment the American public school was conceived, the educrats who created it, crafted it, and gave a rationale for it, the ones who've controlled it and funded it, have, whether we're talking about the teachers union, whether we're talking about the founders of the schools, whether we're talking about major philosophers of education like Dewey, have all had a single-minded purpose for American public schools. And that is, to use one phrase of what we've seen today, that is to condition the will of children. Not to educate them as Rockefeller. And I'll give you another example. So who's Rockefeller? He was just a billionaire plutocrat. He was not educated. He was not an educator, right? But what he used, just like Bill Gates today, who funded much of Common Core, he used his many billions to influence progressively what happened in the school. Well, no, I get you. But anybody who knows the career of, when you get home, take a moment and just Google or Wikipedia John Dewey. You will have categorical proof. I realize that for some of you, this is the first time you're hearing some of these names, but there's huge documentary. In fact, I've got 4 pages of comments from Dewey just like this. He was one of the foremost educational influencers of his day. He's written about 24 books. He worked closely with Horace Mann as a younger man who orchestrated this. He was in on the ground floor of creating pedagogy and teaching and textbooks for the public schools. So it's all part of it. I get it. Let me say this. I get it. I'll send you any information you want. I'll give you my card. Let me talk to you. Let me just introduce you to this, right? Because if we keep going this route, it's going to be 4 o'clock before I'm done. So I promise you, I'll give you all the information you want. And for everybody I've named so far, once I'll send you these slides, you just look into them. Nothing I'm telling you is complicated. Nothing I'm telling you is not already known. So you may be hearing it for the first time, but this is well-documented stuff. And so I will, if you want some more books or resources on Dewey, I'll gladly send them to you. Yes, and I would argue that from what we've seen already so far, one of the main purposes in the people who created and promoted public schools was to violate your Christian rights. And that is easily done. And let me keep adding to this, right? You'll see before we're done here how it all fits together, all right? So again, and notice, by the way, how specific they are in the Christianity stuff. Give you one more. Here's another one. This is one of the spokesmen for the NRA. And this is in 2011. And why is 2011 an important date? That's about the time Common Core was first put in the schools. As Common Core was in the very year being put into the schools, the NRA chief went to the United Nations and argued for why radical sexuality teaching should be taught to our kids. For somebody who's concerned about Christian education, sir, watch this one. 2011, Diane Schneider. She said at the UN, sex. And I put sex there in brackets. Actually, what the quote has is a long list of sexual practices. Very graphic. But I oftentimes have children at these talks, so I just took it out and put sex in. The real quote that I'll send you is more graphic. She said, sex needs to be taught in education. The only way to combat heterosexism and gender conformity is comprehensive sex education. What are the enemies, according to her? Heteronormativity, the idea that men and women belong together. That has to be fought, she said. And gender identity, the idea that biologically there are men and women. Those are the two, if we're going to get rid of Christianity, those are the two things we have to do in the schools. We have to get kids to realize that heterosexuality is itself a construct. It doesn't exist. It's not normal. It's not natural. It's not biological. It's not godly ordained. It's just people bullying other sexualities. And two, we have to convince our young children that there's no such thing as male and female. That's what they did. And so what I'm telling you now is, because you're going to see it, after we do this little talk, take a break, have the second talk, it's going to be all about how they're using sex to do it. But be aware of it. The very year Common Core went into the schools, they were at the UN saying, let me finish the quote. Gender identity expression and sexual orientation are a spectrum, and those opposed to homosexuality are stuck in a binary box that religion and family create. Who are the enemies of the new progressive education? Religion and family. The traditional family and traditional religion. That's what, and she's telling this as an American citizen to the United Nations and calling on them to support worldwide the undermining of the nuclear family, mom, dad, and baby, and religion in general. Now that you've seen, right, a steady set of links between the founding of American education and today, this is Barack Obama's education secretary. For 7 years of Barack Obama's 8 years, he was the guy that Barack Obama put in charge of American schools. He, more than anybody, brought everything you've seen, what Dewey wanted, what Rockefeller wanted, what Diane Schneider wanted, right, what Horace Mann had planned for. He put much of that in place under the guise of Common Core. Here's what he said. Notice the date. It's March of 2009. This is 2 months, not even 2 months after Barack Obama became president. And they already have their comprehensive education reform, and they've already got the funding for it. You know what that means. There's no way Barack Obama takes office in the middle of January. There's no way in a month and a half you could have put together a comprehensive plan like this. None. The whole thing had been orchestrated before, and these are your links, sir, right, going back. The whole thing was there, and now it's being implemented. Listen to what he says on an interview in 2009.
I think our schools should be open 12, 13, 14 hours a day. So it's not just lengthening.
So 8 to 8 or something like that?
At home, we attached healthcare clinics to about 24 of our schools. Where schools truly become the centers of the community, great things happen. And this is a chance to really create what I think the 21st century school has to look like. This needs to be the norm, not the exception. Time matters tremendously, and all of our families need our doors open longer.
Is this a big ticket item in terms of financial resources?
Finances is a piece of this, and we, again, have significant financial resources, unprecedented financial resources coming to the table. But let me be clear, this is thinking differently and being creative.
We want our schools to be open 12, 13, 14 hours a day, 365 days a year. We want our schools, not the family home, not the community church. We want the public schools to be the central aspect of every community. Our network of federal schools in every community, in every suburb, that has to be the center. We want them open all day. Did you hear his little faux pas? Because parents, well, he used the wrong word. Parents want our stores open longer. Oh, and remember what the NEA said in 1969? The schools will have to become clinics. What did he just tell you? In Chicago, where he's from, on our new school construction, we are building clinics. Why? Well, if you're aware of this, this is about the same time Obamacare was being formulated. Under the national health care law, schools, public schools, can give your daughter's birth control, your son's birth control, your daughter's birth control, without consulting you. They can take your 13-year-old daughters and get them abortions without even asking you. You have nothing you can do about that. And here's a story, right? My sister-in-law lives in Houston. She's a single mother. And yes. Yep. From the schools, yeah. So I'll give you my story, which is kind of exemplary of this. My sister-in-law is a single mother in Houston, and her daughter my niece, turned 12 a couple years ago. And when she turned 12 years old in the summer, before classes started in the fall, the school district sent a letter out to all the moms and said, hey, if you've got daughters of this age, they need to get gynecological exams before they're allowed back in school. Literally, the school district said, before your 12, 13-year-old daughters return in the fall, we need documentation from mom and dad that you've given your daughter a gynecological exam. And my sister-in-law, like most moms and dad, if the school says we need this or that, most parents just do it. We've become so conditioned to do what the schools tell us. So I wish she had contacted me because she didn't know why, but she dutifully took her 12-year-old to get a gynecological exam. She submitted the paperwork to the school. Do you know what they were doing it for? No doctor will give a child birth control until they've had a physical exam. So what all these mothers did is they got the exams and the school never told them why. And so once they turned their paperwork in, then within 2 weeks of that, young girls were getting birth control directly from the school because they'd been examined. That's what they did. Go a little further here. By the year before he quit, the Obama administration, here's what Arnie Duncan said had to be next. He wasn't going to be able to stick around to see it happen, but this at the end of his term is said where American public schools have to go.
The one idea I threw out that I wanted to sort of road test it with the kids and see what they thought is the idea of public boarding schools. And that's a little bit of a different idea or a controversial idea, but the question is, do we have some children where there's not a mom, there's not a dad, there's not a grandma, there's just nobody home? And there's certain kids we should have 24/7.
So we're back to public boarding schools. Remember how Horace Mann chose to structure the American public school system? He chose models, right? Yes. Yes, he is. Yep, and the funny thing about Arnie Duncan is that he himself really didn't have a whole lot of educational experience before he became the Secretary of Education. He's got when you're looking up John Dewey, look up Arnie Duncan. It's pretty shocking what you're going to find about him, too. Give you one example. In the Chicago schools that he was the superintendent of, he was the superintendent of Chicago schools before he became Barack Obama's Secretary of Education. There was an adult male teacher who had a sexual relationship with an 11-year-old boy in the public schools. And when the parents found out and they went to Arnie Duncan, the superintendent, to complain, Arnie Duncan said to the parents, your son should be flattered that an older man took an interest in him. You should be flattered, he said to him, right? It is an outrage. But guys, if I keep answering your questions, this is going to go on a long time. All right, one more. Yes. Yep. Sure, and we're going to get to pedophilia, but you're exactly right. The LGBTQ community has a huge influence in what's happening with these latest. Let me move forward. I promise I'm going where you're thinking, all right? But my point is you heard what he said, right? Public boarding schools. What we need is, and do we have this problem, by the way? Let me ask you this. Do we actually have a problem in this country of 7-year-olds living alone in buildings? No. We do not have that crisis. But let's pretend for a moment we do. Let's pretend that there is a crisis of kids with no supervision at all. Do you not have county agencies to fix that? Do you not have state agencies to fix that? Do you not have religious institutions to fix that? Do you see what he's saying? There are some children that maybe we, the federal government, ought to have 24/7. There are some kids who we should, and here's the problem with that way of thinking. Right now, he's saying kids who are unsupervised, and I think we could all agree, if there are children with no supervision, we should get them supervision. But once you have this proposed system of federal boarding schools, how soon is it before they'll take your kids and federally educate them if you believe marriage is between a man and a woman? To the degree to which the LGBTQ organizations, the activists, are participating in this, what if you disagree? They're already trying to do it. What do you disagree if your 11-year-old girl thinks she's a boy? What if you disagree that she should be given hormone treatment? The minute you have these public boarding schools, that's what happens, right? Now, again, he even said, that's kind of a controversial idea, but we need to do it. How far away? Let's say Hillary Clinton won the last election, and you had a radical progressive Arnie Duncan running education. Now, how far do you think we are from federal boarding schools? So you begin what you see? In the last 10 years now, do you see how many of the talking points we heard down through history are now being brought in? How many of those things that were dreamed about in 1850 or 1930 or 1980 are now being pinpointed? And people ask me all the time, why now? Well, another parallel thing. Remember in 1998 when Hillary Clinton proposed Obamacare and everybody laughed? She proposed Hillary Care, but everybody laughed. 20 years later, you got it again, right? What happened in the space of 20 years? Well, how about this? In 2008, Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton were both advocates of traditional marriage. They did not support gay marriage. They said it directly. We believe, both of them in 2008, we believe marriage is between a man and a woman. Within 4 years, both of them now were on the gay marriage bandwagon, right? In 2008, it was inconceivable you'd have gay marriage. Now it's considered as normal as anything. Would you have believed 5 years ago that boys would be showering with girls in public school locker rooms? It's happening now. You ask me why it's happening now? Because the long dreams of socialists are moving quickly. Well, look, I said it before. Of the 20 Democrat presidential campaigns, 19 of them are avowed socialists. 10 years ago, you could not be a serious contender for public office if you said you were a socialist. Now, almost the entirety of the Democrat nominees are socialists. That's what, so if you find this hard to believe, look at every other aspect of American life. Borders, right? You got a major political party that says there should be no borders, and half the Republicans agree with them. Jeb Bush wants no borders. The Koch brothers, one of them just died, they don't want borders. So this is not that outrageous when you think about every other aspect of culture. In fact, what I'm trying to show you here is how obvious it is based on what the intentions have been. This should not surprise you. If you understand what I have tried to show you in the first 40 minutes, you will see that this is exactly what they conceived from the very beginning. And if you recognize that, then nothing will surprise you, right? And now you have intellectual ways of recognizing what's coming next. Gets better. It's Bill Gates. Again, what qualifications to be involved in education does Bill Gates have? He's a radical left-wing ideologue with billions of dollars. But he spent $7 to $11 billion putting Common Core in your schools. He bought textbooks, he gave technology to lots of schools because they couldn't afford to, right? Common Core couldn't have worked unless somebody came up with money because the states didn't have it. So Bill Gates spent billions of his own dollars bringing in all that new stuff and getting rid of the old stuff. Can you imagine if some right-wing billionaire did this? It would be all over the newspapers, right? Can you imagine if the Koch brothers did this? Radical right-wing billionaires buy public education. Did you ever see that headline about Bill Gates? Nope. It would be like, imagine if the NRA, the National Rifle Association, speaking about the LGBTQ groups, that Planned Parenthood is helping to write this curriculum. Can you imagine if a private organization like the NRA was in the public schools, writing curriculum for public school students to teach them to appreciate guns? The left would lose their mind. But radical left-wing private organizations like Planned Parenthood, like various LGBTQ alliances, are writing your kids' curriculum and no one's saying a word. They're not teachers, by the way. Planned Parenthood is not a teaching organization, but they're writing much of the sexuality curriculum your kids are studying today. And no one cares because it's radical and progressive. So here's Bill Gates. You were told when Common Core came out, you were told that the Common Core standards are better than what you have. How would they have known it? They just invented them. They'd never been tested. They lied to you. And all your many of your state legislators and many of your school people said, oh, these are high standards. No one bothered to ask, how do you know that? In fact, I've got proof. 2012, Bill Gates, the guy who paid for a lot of this, here's what he said about the Common Core standards.
It would be great if our education stuff worked, but that we won't know for probably a decade.
There you go. You were told that Common Core are high standards, much better for Louisiana kids. In 2012, he said, we won't even know if it's going to work for 10 years. Your kids were guinea pigs for this. We won't even know until 2022 if it works. Well, the one thing he was wrong about, it's 2019 and we know it didn't work, all right? But how do you go backwards now? So let's say Louisiana, you decide tomorrow, you want all this stuff gone. Every citizen of Louisiana decides tomorrow, this has to end. Where are you going to get the money now to get rid of all that old textbooks and buy new ones for every school district? That's why your lawmakers don't want to do anything. Even if we get rid of Common Core, there's no right-wing Bill Gates that's going to give us all that money. Where are we going to get the money from? Oh, and by the way, the textbook companies aren't even printing traditional textbooks anymore. You cannot buy anymore textbooks that are non-Common Core. So we're going to get them. This was a concerted effort across the board to completely transcend the way we teach our kids. It gets better. How many of you remember when the Republican George Bush went out in 2008 and the Democrat Barack Obama came in? Both the Democrat and the Republican reminded us that unless you cough up billions and billions of dollars for stimulus funding, remember that? We've got to prop up the banks and the car companies or the whole system's going to collapse. Did you know that billions and billions of your stimulus money went directly to Arne Duncan at the Department of Education to create Common Core? Listen to what Bill Gates says about this in 2009. Again, within a month and a half of Obama being elected, they have already got it done. And what that tells you, that it didn't just start there. That when Obama was the president who finally got elected, where they could hand him what they had been working on from the beginning. And listen to what Bill Gates says.
We'll only know if this effort has succeeded when the curriculum and tests are aligned to these standards.
Listen to this.
Secretary Arne Duncan recently announced that $350 million of the stimulus package will be used to create just these kinds of tests. Next generation assessments aligned to the Common Core. When the tests are aligned to the common standards, the curriculum will line up as well.
So, within the first month and a half of the Obama presidency, already $350 million of the stimulus, which was extorted from us. You either pay us this tax money or the whole system collapses, wasn't used to prop up banks, wasn't used to prop up the economy, was handed right to the Department of Education to create the tests for Common Core. In fact, they made the tests before they even had the standards. That's exactly how you do not create education. You create a solid curriculum, you measure it, and then you test it. They had the tests first, which tells you something. It was never meant to be an educational curriculum, right? And what qualifications does Bill Gates have to be involved in any of this? He's the spokesperson for this? What office did you elect him to? What kind of democratic oversight do we have for this guy? And it gets worse, actually. That's David Coleman. He is the guy who wrote the standards. Him and a committee of 5 other people wrote the Common Core standards that Louisiana kids are suffering under right now. All the American kids are suffering under, right? Even though you'll be told we don't have Common Core here. Yeah, you do, and I'll explain that in a moment too. But he wrote it. This guy has no education experience. He's never taught a class. He has no degree in education. You want to know how he got the job? He was Barack Obama's social media director in 2008. In other words, he got a lot of kids on Twitter and Facebook to go out and vote for Barack Obama. That's his only qualification. He's never been elected to public office. I'm sure almost none of you have even heard his name before. But he's the guy who completely transformed your schools without any input from the taxpayers and the voters. Speaking of homosexuality, he's a homosexual, a radical activist in the homosexual community, which is why so much of the Common Core is linked up to radical homosexual groups, right? Let me prove it to you. Here he is being introduced in 2011, the very year the standards were put in the school. Here he is being introduced to a bunch of teachers who he is now the boss of.
He has been involved in virtually every step of setting the national standards, and he doesn't have a single credential for it. He's never taught in an elementary school, I think. I actually don't know. He's never edited a scholarly journal, but I think he has written scholarly papers, and a variety of other things that everybody here has done some of. He hasn't done.
You'd think someone with Lauren's experience would understand you never tell the truth when you're introducing someone.
I actually think it's really important to try to base what I'm about to say to you on evidence I share with you rather than on the sands of my qualifications. So if I ask you or talk to you about doing something, it should be evident that it makes sense to you to do because I have no other authority.
Because I have no other authority. I have no qualifications. Now do you understand what I'm telling you? That Common Core was never about making your kids better, smarter, or more educated. The guy who wrote the standards has no ability to make your kids read better. He has no ability to make your kids do math better. This is 100% a sociological and ideological takeover of education from people who have no interest in improving your kids' schools. In fact, their interest is in keeping them mediocre so young minds can be ruined and transformed to their way of thinking. Remember that go all the way back to John Dewey in the 1920s, right? Students who know how to think for themselves spoil the harmony of the coming collective, right? It gets better. He has his own private education fund, organization that's made millions up from the federal government for him to do this. And let me remind you, the person who transformed your kids' schools is a person who you've never heard of, who has no educational experience, who has no accountable to you. You guys pay for the public school system with your taxes. No one asked you. You don't know. This is a end run around constitutional government. This is banana republic stuff. This is what happens in third world dictators where unelected, unaccountable people make radical changes and you never even know about it. Listen to what he says about his own organization here.
So with that in mind, I'm about to jump in, but I'm just going to say one word about my own organization, which is Student Achievement Partners. Student Achievement Partners, all you need to know about us are a couple of things. One is we're composed of that collection of unqualified people who were involved in developing the common standards.
We are that collection of unqualified people who wrote your kids' standards. Do you understand? What gets me about this is, do you see that the people who did this to you told you what they were doing? 2011 and 12 and 13, when they, see, this is what I love about this talk. You can no longer think, I wouldn't blame you. Who is this Yankee carpetbagger come down to talk to us? I wouldn't blame you if you were sitting there thinking, what is this guy going to tell us about education in the South? I get it. But now do you see, it doesn't even matter if I could be the biggest tinfoil hat wearer in the world. They're telling you this is not complicated. The people doing this to you are looking you in the eye and telling you, and no one's listening to them. They've been telling you for 150 years. Yeah. Exactly right. Well, there is, you can absolutely see how demonic this is, right? It gets better. How many of you have heard from, in the Common Core stuff, oh, you guys are overreacting. Common Core is just a set of standards. Our teachers are free to teach any way they want to. Our teachers can teach what they want. Listen to what Arnie Duncan says about this. David Coleman.
Which is, teachers will teach towards the test. There is no force strong enough on this earth to prevent that. There's no amount of hand-waving. There's no amount of saying they teach to the standards, not the test. We don't do that here, whatever.
This unelected, unqualified guy who completely transformed American public schools just told you that your teachers will teach to my tests, and there is no force strong enough on this earth to prevent it. Even your teachers, even your good, conscientious teachers, are being backed into a corner about what they can and can't do in the classroom. I've talked to thousands of teachers across the country. Again, I've given 800 talks in 48 states. I've testified before 24 state legislatures. I got a pile on my desk back in Wisconsin of over 10,000 letters from from teachers, saying exactly this, that we can't, that if we don't teach what they tell us to, we could get fired, right? I've got teachers tell me, I would love to come to your talk, but if my superintendent sees me there, I'll get fired. Because this is now federalized, it's controlled at the top here. It really is creepy when you think about it. This is Jason Zimba. I mentioned that Common Core was produced by a group of about 5 people. He's the guy who wrote the math standards, Jason Zimba. He wrote the math standards for the kids. And in his own admission in this video, he's going to tell you that my Common Core math curriculum will not prepare your kids for STEM careers. We gave the American people a universal math curriculum that will not prepare them to science, technology, engineering, or math. We did that. He's also going to tell you it won't even prepare your kids for 4-year college math. So ask yourself, you're admitting on tape that the mandatory math curriculum for American schools will not make them math ready for college and will not prepare them for STEM. Yep, exactly right. So when you hear this, it's like a disconnect. But now that you've seen what you've seen, it's not a disconnect. Here's the reason for it. Again, math is one of those things that we're not equal in. Some kids get math like this. Some kids are born mathematical thinkers. I wasn't. When I was in 3rd grade, I had a 2nd grade math ability. I still have a 2nd grade math ability. I just don't know how to think that way. But when I was in 3rd grade, I also had a 12th grade reading level, and I was allowed to read 12th grade books. We've gotten rid of it. In the last 5 years, we've got rid of more gifted and talented programs for kids in the high schools than in the previous 40 years combined. It's no longer, you got kids like me who could read at the 12th grade level in 3rd grade, not allowed to do it anymore. It's not fair that I have that gift. And so kids today who are really good at math are artificially being held down because to get ahead of your kids is socially unjust, right? And the fact that your kid is really good at math and I was bad at math, that's unfair. So what we're going to do is we're going to teach a low level of math, and he's going to tell you this. We're going to teach a very low level of math so all kids feel comfortable with some math. And by the way, what will that do to the kids who actually get math? It's going to destroy it, right? Those kids who can do math and aren't permitted to do it are going to get utterly frustrated. But that, to the progressives, is social justice. only teach enough math that an idiot math student like me feel like I actually know something. And those kids who are capable of higher level math, hold them back. See, this is the trick. And by the way, it's very socialist, isn't it? In socialism, it doesn't matter how talented you are. It doesn't matter how much you try. It doesn't matter how smart you are. You get exactly what everybody else gets, right? I could do nothing. I could be lazy. I could stink at my job. You could be a go-getter and brilliant at your job. You work hard, but we're getting the same thing. That's what this math curriculum is. Here, listen to he's being interviewed here, and you'll see what he says. He's being interviewed by a professor, Sandy Stotsky, who the Common Core people hired to vet the curriculum, and she said it stunk, get rid of it, and they fired her. One of the only professors she was actually hired to look at the curriculum said it stinks, it's bad math, it's bad English. So she gets a chance now to grill him on his own math program.
The definition of college readiness, I think it's a fair critique that it's a minimal definition of college.
I think, Dr. Stotsky, that your critique is correct. That my math program is a minimum curriculum for college readiness.
The definition of college readiness, I think it's a fair critique that it's a minimal definition of college readiness.
For some colleges.
Well, for the colleges most kids go to, but not that most parents probably aspire, right?
It's not for STEM. It's not for international
That's true. It's not only not for STEM, it's also
issue.
not for selective colleges.
My math program is not only not for STEM careers, it's also not for selective colleges. And let me define that for you. A selective college in math is any college that has a basic math requirement to get in, which is to say all of them. Not only is my math program not for STEM, it's not for selective math colleges. I won't stop it again this time, but listen one more time.
The definition of college readiness, I think it's a fair critique that it's a minimal definition of college readiness.
For some colleges.
Well, for the colleges most kids go to, but not that most parents probably aspire, right?
It's not for STEM. It's not for international
That's true. It's not only not for STEM, it's also
issue.
not for selective colleges that, for example, UC Berkeley, even whether you're going to be an engineer or not, you'd better have pre-calculus to get
But
into
we
UC
have to
Berkeley,
think of our
right?
engineering colleges
And that's
scientific
That's true.
education.
I think the third pathway goes a lot towards that, but your issue is really broader than that.
Oh, yes.
So I just wanted to make sure that we got that
I'm
out.
not just thinking of selective colleges. There's a much broader question here.
Okay, listen to this.
That's right. It's both, I think, in the sense of being clear about what this college readiness does and doesn't get you, and that's the big subject.
But not to call something college ready when it only applies to a certain kind of college and a certain lower level of mathematical expertise that won't buy you far on the international market in most major disciplines of technology, economics, business, and so on.
And all he can do is shake his head yes, right? He's on record, Jason Zimba, of saying that maybe Common Core math might prepare your kid to begin a two-year technical college, maybe. It's not college and career ready. It is not STEM friendly. So you've heard that, right? You've got to close up the disconnect. It sounds outrageous to you. But it's not outrageous if you take everything I've just said to you into account. It is the plan. The plan is to keep your kids undereducated. Look, less than 38% of American kids go to college. That's socially unjust. So, what you're telling me is what's going on here, right? Why are the Democrat candidates, why are they all calling for mandatory free college? Because what they want your kids in college for the ideology, not for the education. Look, at my university, the University of Wisconsin, which is considered to be a very good college system, my senior and junior English majors have about an 8th grade, 9th grade reading level. My college kids are reading at a high school level. How'd they get into college? Because to turn kids away is now bigotry. Everyone should go to, isn't that what you're hearing from the Democrats? Everyone should go to college. Well, wait a second. Many kids aren't qualified to go to college, and many kids don't want to go. If you say everybody has to go, then by definition, what is the college? If we're taking everybody for fear of excluding anyone, then guess what colleges are doing? They're lowering their standards. The universities now, look, if you bring 40% of your student body in, are kids who shouldn't be there, because they can't do the work, you can't then turn around and fail them. If you fail 40% of the kids you bring in, then your whole inclusivity program goes out the window. If you bring in kids who don't belong, you got to make sure they get through. And so what you're seeing now in college is a social promotion. We're lowering class standards. What they're telling you is anyone who goes to college should get a degree, simply for going. So what really is happening is college is now becoming high school. And what the progressives want is they want your kids, and the same progressives who want free college want mandatory pre-K. A major study was just done by the University of Tennessee, which shows that kids who go to preschool have no academic advantages over kids who don't, and they have bigger discipline and emotional problems. So you take a kid, instead of letting a kid be home with mom until they're 5 and go to kindergarten, you get kids at 3 in preschool. Those kids do not show any academic achievement over the kids who start at 5, and they have more emotional and more anger issues than the ones who stayed at 5. And yet, why do they want mandatory pre-K? If you put your kids in the state schools from the time they're 3, and everybody goes to college for free, then from the ages of 3 to 25, your kids will be completely under the guise of this kind of one-size-fits-all education. And if they've got your kids from 3 years old to 25-year-old, now do you understand why they turn out to be Antifa members? Indoctrination centers, college kids. Who is Antifa? It is college kids. 99% of Antifa is college kids. And what are they doing? They want to burn it up. They want to rip it down. They want to get rid of the First Amendment. They want to get rid of the Second Amendment. They're fighting fascists by censorship and violence, not recognizing that makes them fascists too. But there's no critical thinking. The same Antifa who says, we're fighting Nazis. How are you fighting Nazis? By throwing bricks and hitting them with hammers, and by not letting them speak, and by censoring them, and by having their platforms deplatformed on social media. Wait, so you're fighting censorship, oppression, and violence with censorship, oppression, and violence, and you don't have the critical thinking to see it. That's what happens. What was the purpose of the Hitler Youth? The Hitler Youth were kids who were so brainwashed that when they grew up, they were capable of any atrocity because their entire critical thinking and moral compass had been taken from them. What do you think this is aiming for here? It's the same thing. And while we're on it, a couple things about Louisiana. Oh, I'm sorry, first, Jason Zimba. One of the features of Common Core math and Common Core in general, as I said at the beginning of the talk, is they don't want your input. They don't care what you think, and they don't want your input. We've got dads who are engineers, moms who have PhDs in math. We've got CPAs who cannot help their 7th graders with their math homework. What kind of math program makes it impossible for a PhD in math to help an 8-year-old? But that's the system. And when Jason Zimba was asked about this, he said, stop helping your kids with math. Jason Zimba, the lead writer of the Common Core math standards, advises parents to avoid teaching their children how to do math problems. Quote, the math instruction on the part of the parents should be low. The teacher is there to explain the curriculum. And I've talked to thousands of Common Core math teachers, and most of them to this day still don't quite understand what Common Core is. They're winging it, they're just doing it, they don't know. But that's the point. It's an incoherent math program, which means everybody can pass it, but nobody learns real math. Louisiana. You keep being told, we don't have Common Core in Louisiana, right? You did. You changed the name. Every state in the union just rebranded it. And you know, it started in the first one to do it was Indiana. The governor of Indiana was your vice president, Mike Pence. About 4 years ago, Mike Pence was the governor of Indiana, and Indiana moms and dads got really mad about Common Core and they wanted it gone. So Mike Pence says, sure, we'll get rid of it. I declare Common Core dead in Indiana. And what did he do? He handed the education curriculum right back to his progressive school board members. And what did they do? They kept 98.5% of Common Core and they renamed them the Indiana State Standards. You took Common Core and you renamed them the Louisiana Standards, right? Florida took Common Core and they renamed them the Sunshine State Standards. So technically, when you walk into the school and all the kids are busy doing their homework, their Common Core nonsense, and the principal looks you in the eye and says, we don't do Common Core here. Technically, he's right. It's called the Louisiana State. But this is notice this sheet here. 1, 2, 3. These are your Louisiana State, a huge chunk of your Louisiana State standards. All the green is word for word Common Core. All that green is word for word without a single missing period or comma. Most of your Louisiana State standards are Common Core. And the little mauve section right there, if you read it, all that has changed is a couple of language issues. No, it's the same idea, just slightly rephrased. In other words, your curriculum is 99% Common Core, and they didn't even bother to rewrite it. It's the same stuff. They just branded Louisiana State standards, right? And this was given to me by an activist in your state who compiled this, right? It's the same thing, word for word. And when you get the slide, you'll be able to read it. The writing is, you'll be able to see it. Here's what Common Core says. Here's what your Louisiana State Standard says. And in those rare instances where there is a diversion, it's a which or a that gets switched, right? It is utterly unsubstantial. There's no difference. And here's what Common Core has wrought in 8 years. We have these things called NAEP tests, N-A-E-P. They are the gold standard of how we measure kids' achievement. The people who run the national assessment tests are largely apolitical. It's pure statistical analysis. And here's what we know for 2017. The 2018 are about to come out. In 2017, 65% of 8th graders in American public schools could not read at an 8th grade level. 65% of American school kids, 8th graders, could not read at an 8th grade level. On average, they were reading at a 6th grade level. And 67% of American school kids from coast to coast, 67% could not do 8th grade math. They were doing 6th grade math. 67 and 65% of the entire country's children are 2 years behind where they're supposed to be in reading and math. And you think that's bad? Go into the inner cities. The social justice warriors, the progressives, they keep telling you that they're doing what they do because they want to help the deprived, they want to help minorities, they want to help inner city kids. That's nationally. Do you know what the numbers are for inner city kids? Much worse. Look at that. In Detroit, inner city, largely African American kids in Detroit, only 5% of Detroit school kids, 5, can read or do math at the 8th grade level. They're 2 years behind. Fresno, it's only 11. Baltimore, 11. Cleveland, Ohio, 11%. Milwaukee, 12%. The bigger and the more racially concentrated the big city, the less those kids perform. So Common Core, which was done in the name of social justice, to lower overall achievement for everybody, to make it look like struggling kids were doing better, actually hammers those same kids worse. They're what? This is a complete and total lie. This whole thing is a lie. What they're trying to do is drive all kids down to the lowest performing kids, because then you'll have equality. Look, if you make smart kids dumber and dumber, if you refuse to let high-achieving kids achieve, sooner or later, they're going to drop. It's very difficult to raise low-performing kids high, but it's really easy. And you see the socialism of that? That is a socialist understanding of people, right? That in the name of equity, you have to lower. I'll give you one example. Chairman Mao, right, the communist leader, 1948, when he took power, the first thing he did is he took all the surgeons and the doctors, all the highly educated medical people, and he transferred them to farms where they had to shovel poop. He took all the farmers and put them in the hospital and at gunpoint made them perform surgeries on people. Oh, it's true. He took the farmers and at gunpoint made them operate on sick people, all of whom died. And the point was, in Mao's China, everybody's the same. They estimate that hundreds of thousands were murdered by being forced to be treated by farmers. And the purpose, and that was an easy price for Mao to pay to send a message. You will be the same, right? I'll send you the slide so you can read it more carefully. But this is your ACT performance. You know the test you have to take in college. Here is Louisiana's ACT performance since 2013. It's the slide on the right. In 2013, only 60% of Louisiana kids were qualified to do English at the college level. Only 29% of Louisiana kids in 2013 were qualified for college math. Only 33% could do the reading. Only 25% were able to do science. And the number of Louisiana kids in 2013 who were ready to start college in all four areas, 16% under Common Core. Here you are now in 2018, and that number's dropped to 15%. In math, it's dropped to 53. So in each of the Common Core years, it gets worse. You, Louisiana, have been at the bottom of the national education rankings for 50 years. And with all the money and all the time spent and all the hijacking of your schools and all the politics they've dumped in, your schools have not improved at all. They've gotten worse. But that's not a mistake. That's what they want, right? They don't want you or any other school doing better. They want them to level off. And by the way, remember David Coleman? That guy? Guess what his job is now? Without any education experience. Did you know that as soon as the Common Core standards were written, he became the CEO and president of the college boards, the organization who writes the ACTs. So the same guy with no experience now is president of the company who gives your kids their college tests. How's that for cronyism? How's that for an undermining of your democracy? This guy is now the president responsible for writing the ACTs that your college kids have to take. If they want to, kids take, they have to go to college. So he wrote the bad standards, now he's doing it to the ACTs as well.